So let's rewind the clock, way back. Before the slick glass slabs we carry today, before Android, and even before most of us had the internet in our pockets. We're talking about the 1980s. Samsung, already a massive conglomerate in South Korea, making everything from TVs to microwaves, decided to jump into the nascent mobile phone business. Their first real attempt was the SC100 in 1988. This thing was a brick, designed for cars because you certainly weren't carrying it around comfortably. It was a classic 80s car phone, and honestly it wasn't a hit. In fact, the quality was so notoriously poor that it barely sold. It was a tough, humbling start. This initial failure could have been the end of Samsung's mobile ambitions, but they are nothing if not persistent. They went back to the drawing board, focusing intensely on research and development. This became a core part of their identity. Instead of giving up, they doubled down. They learned from their mistakes with the SC100 and came back with the SH100, their first actual handheld mobile phone. It was still chunky by today's standards, but it was a massive improvement. This period was all about learning the fundamentals of radio technology, manufacturing, and design in a rapidly evolving industry. Samsung wasn't a leader yet, not by a long shot, but they were laying the groundwork for what was to come. The 1990s and early 2000s were where Samsung started to find its footing. They produced a wide array of feature phones. Clamshells, sliders, candy bars, you name it, they probably made a version of it. They became known for experimenting with different form factors and features. Remember those phones with the little external screens, or the ones that flipped open in a cool way? Samsung was all over that. They were building a reputation for solid hardware and, importantly, for their screens. Even back then, their display quality was a step above many competitors. This era established them as a major player in the feature phone world, setting the stage for the smartphone revolution that was just around the corner. This journey from the failed SC100 to a global feature phone powerhouse is crucial to understanding the company's DNA. It shows a relentless drive to improve and an obsession with hardware. They weren't afraid to throw things at the wall to see what would stick, a strategy that would define their approach for years to come. They learned how to build phones at a massive scale and how to compete in a crowded market. They weren't the innovators leading the charge just yet, but they were becoming incredibly good at being fast followers, ready to capitalize on the next big thing. And that next big thing was about to be announced by a company in Cupertino. Then, 2007 happened. Apple unveiled the first iPhone, and it completely changed the game. The entire mobile industry was caught off guard. Suddenly, physical keyboards and small screens felt ancient. For Samsung, this was both a threat and a massive opportunity. They saw what Apple did and knew they had to respond, and fast. Their initial attempts were a bit clunky, part of their old strategy of releasing many different types of phones running various operating systems like Windows Mobile and their own Bada OS. But they quickly realized that to truly compete, they needed a unified front, a single, powerful brand to rival the iPhone. And so, the Galaxy was born. The Samsung Galaxy S, launched in 2010, was the turning point. This was Samsung's first true all-in iPhone killer. It ran on Android, which was Google's answer to iOS, and it had specs that were, on paper, seriously impressive. It featured a big, beautiful Super AMOLED screen that made the iPhone's display look a little dull by comparison. It had a powerful processor for its time, and a design that, while let's be honest, borrowed some inspiration from Apple, was distinct enough to stand on its own. Samsung's strategy was clear: beat the iPhone on hardware. They offered a bigger screen, a more vibrant display, and the openness of the Android operating system. What made the Galaxy S so successful was not just the phone itself, but the marketing blitz that came with it. Samsung poured billions of dollars into advertising, positioning the Galaxy brand as the cool, clever alternative to the iPhone. Their commercials often poked fun at Apple users, painting them as mindless followers waiting in long lines, while Galaxy users were the smart ones who had already moved on to better technology. This aggressive marketing, combined with strong carrier partnerships around the world, meant that the Galaxy S was everywhere. You couldn't turn on a TV or walk into a phone store without seeing it. This strategy worked incredibly well. Each new iteration of the Galaxy S line, the S2, the S3, got better and better, refining the formula and building a massive global user base. The Galaxy S2 was a critical darling, praised for its thin design and powerful performance. The Galaxy S3 was a monster hit, selling tens of millions of units and cementing Samsung as Apple's one true rival in the high-end smartphone space. They had successfully created a brand that was just as recognizable as the iPhone, and had proven that there was a huge market for premium Android phones. The Galaxy had risen, and Samsung was ready to take the crown. One of the biggest weapons in Samsung's arsenal during its rise was its display technology. This wasn't just a minor feature, it was a core pillar of their strategy, and a massive competitive advantage. Samsung, through its subsidiary Samsung Display, was one of the few companies that could manufacture its own mobile screens at scale. More importantly, they were pioneers in AMOLED, active matrix organic light-emitting diode technology. This was a game-changer. Unlike traditional LCD screens that required a backlight, each pixel in an AMOLED display produced its own light. This meant they could achieve perfect inky blacks simply by turning the pixels off. This technology, which they branded as Super AMOLED, made their phone screens pop with incredibly vibrant, almost hyper-realistic colors. When you placed a Galaxy S phone next to an iPhone with its LCD Retina display, the difference was immediately obvious. The Samsung screen was brighter, had higher contrast, and the colors just seemed to leap off the glass. For the average consumer walking into a store, this visual wow factor was a powerful selling point. It made other phones look washed out and dated in comparison. Samsung knew this and leaned into it heavily in their marketing and in-store displays, always showing off colorful, high-contrast imagery. Their control over the manufacturing process was also a huge strategic asset. While other companies, including Apple, had to source their displays from third-party suppliers like LG or Japan Display, Samsung made its own. This meant they could innovate faster, putting the latest and greatest screen technology into their own flagship phones first. It also created a fascinating dynamic where they were both Apple's biggest competitor and one of its key suppliers. For years, Samsung was able to keep its best display panels for its own Galaxy devices, giving them a clear hardware advantage that was difficult for anyone else to match. This focus on display excellence extended beyond just the flagship S series. Samsung started to use its Super AMOLED screens across its product lineup, bringing that premium visual experience to more affordable price points. This helped solidify their brand identity. A Samsung phone, whether it was a high-end Note or a mid-range A series, meant you were getting a great screen. This advantage was critical in their battle against Apple and other Android manufacturers. In a market where specs were becoming increasingly similar, having the undisputed best display was a clear, tangible reason for a customer to choose a Galaxy phone over anything else. It was their visual signature. By 2013, Samsung had reached the summit. All the years of investment, aggressive marketing, and hardware innovation had paid off in a big way. They officially surpassed Nokia and Apple to become the world's largest smartphone manufacturer by market share. It was a monumental achievement. They weren't just a competitor to the iPhone anymore. They were the global leader, dominating sales charts in nearly every region of the world. Their strategy of offering a wide range of devices from the ultra-premium Galaxy Note series to budget-friendly models meant they had a phone for literally every type of consumer and every price point. This was the height of their power. The Galaxy S4, launched in that peak year, was the embodiment of Samsung's philosophy at the time: more is more. The phone was packed to the brim with software features. It had eye tracking to scroll pages, hand gestures to answer calls, and a dozen other smart functions. While many of these features felt more like gimmicks than genuinely useful innovations, it showed Samsung's determination to win the spec war. They were throwing everything at the wall, and the sheer volume of features was impressive to many consumers. The S4 sold in record numbers, becoming one of the best-selling Android phones of all time and cementing Samsung's position at the top. Their dominance wasn't just in the high-end market either. While the Galaxy S and Note series battled Apple for the premium crown, Samsung's mid-range and low-end devices were conquering emerging markets. In places like India, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, Samsung's brand recognition and vast distribution network made them the default choice. They offered affordable smartphones that gave many people their first taste of the internet. This two-pronged approach, fighting Apple at the top and sweeping up the volume at the bottom, created a seemingly unstoppable juggernaut. They were selling hundreds of millions of phones every year. However, looking back, this peak in 2013 also contained the seeds of their future struggles. Their software was becoming bloated and complex. a stark contrast to Apple's clean and simple iOS. Their design language, heavily reliant on glossy plastic, was starting to feel cheap compared to the premium metal and glass construction of the iPhone. And their strategy of releasing dozens of different phone models was about to be challenged by a new wave of competitors who were learning from Samsung's own playbook. For a moment, though, they were on top of the world, the undisputed king of the smartphone hill. Just as Samsung reached its zenith, a new threat was emerging from its own backyard, metaphorically speaking. A wave of Chinese manufacturers, led by companies like Huawei, Xiaomi, and later Oppo and Vivo, began to make their presence felt. At first they were dismissed as makers of cheap knockoffs, but they learned and evolved at an astonishing pace. They saw the blueprint Samsung had used to challenge Apple offer compelling hardware with competitive specs at a lower price, and they decided to do the exact same thing to Samsung, but even more aggressively, especially in the mid-range and budget segments. These new players had several advantages. They had access to the same supply chains in Shenzhen for components like processors, memory, and cameras. They operated with leaner business models, often selling directly to consumers online, which cut down on marketing and distribution costs. This allowed them to offer phones with specs that were surprisingly close to Samsung's flagship devices, but for a fraction of the price. A company like Xiaomi, with its My Phones, built a massive following by offering incredible value for money. Suddenly, consumers in markets like India and China could get a phone that felt 90% as good as a Galaxy S, for 50% of the cost. Huawei in particular became a major thorn in Samsung's side. They invested heavily in camera technology, partnering with Leica to create phones that often surpassed both Samsung and Apple in photo quality. They also pushed the boundaries of design with premium materials and innovative features. Huawei wasn't just competing on price, they were starting to compete on innovation, directly challenging Samsung's position in the premium Android space. This put Samsung in a tough spot. For years, they were the premium Android alternative to Apple. Now, they had other Android players eating into that share from below, and even from the side. This intense competition from Chinese brands completely changed the dynamics of the global smartphone market. Samsung's market share, especially in Asia, began to erode rapidly. They were once the dominant player in China, but within a few years, their share plummeted to less than 1% as local brands took over. The same story started to play out in India and other key growth markets. The very strategy that had propelled Samsung to the top, offering great hardware for a good price, was now being used against them by hungrier, more agile competitors. The tide was turning, and Samsung found itself fighting a war on a new front it wasn't fully prepared for. One of Samsung's key strategies during its growth phase was to saturate the market with a dizzying array of phone models. There was the flagship Galaxy S, the larger Galaxy Note, the mid-range Galaxy A, the budget Galaxy J, and honestly, dozens of other variants in between. The thinking was simple. Have a phone for every possible niche and price point, ensuring that no matter what a customer was looking for, there was a Samsung phone for them. For a while, this carpet-bombing approach worked, helping them build massive volume and market share. It was a strategy of brute force, overwhelming competitors through sheer quantity. However, as the market matured, this strength started to become a significant weakness. For consumers, the sheer number of choices became confusing. What was the real difference between a Galaxy A7 and a Galaxy J8? Which one was better? The naming conventions were often inconsistent, and the feature sets overlapped. This created a paradox of choice where customers felt overwhelmed and found it difficult to make a clear decision. It diluted the power of the Galaxy brand. Instead of standing for one clear premium product, Galaxy became a catch-all term for dozens of phones of varying quality, which ultimately weakened its premium appeal. Contrast this with Apple's approach. For years, Apple released just one, maybe two, new iPhone models per year. The lineup was incredibly simple. You could buy the new one, or maybe the slightly older one for a bit less. This clarity was a massive advantage. Consumers knew exactly what an iPhone was. It represented the best of what Apple had to offer. There was no confusion, no dilution of the brand. This focused strategy also allowed Apple to pour all of its engineering and marketing resources into making that one device as perfect as possible. Samsung, on the other hand, had its resources spread thin across a vast and complex portfolio. This product line confusion also made software updates a nightmare. Supporting dozens of different models with different chipsets and hardware configurations meant that Android updates were often slow to arrive on Samsung devices, if they arrived at all, especially for the non-flagship models. This frustrated users and made the phones feel old faster. Apple, with its handful of models, could push out iOS updates to all supported devices on the same day. Samsung's sprawling lineup created a logistical challenge that hurt the long-term user experience and made their phones less appealing to tech-savvy buyers who valued timely software support. A critical factor in the long-term smartphone battle has always been the ecosystem. This is where Apple has maintained an almost unassailable advantage. The walled garden of iOS, macOS, watchOS, and services like iMessage, FaceTime, and iCloud creates a powerful lock-in effect. Once you buy an iPhone, you're more likely to buy an iPad, a Mac, or an Apple Watch because they all work together so seamlessly. Your messages sync instantly, you can copy and paste between devices, and your photos are available everywhere. This ecosystem is sticky. Leaving it means giving up a level of convenience and integration that is hard to replicate elsewhere. Samsung, on the other hand, operates in the open field of the Android ecosystem. While Android offers freedom and choice, it lacks that deep, seamless integration. Samsung relies on Google for its operating system, its App Store, and many of its core services like Gmail, Maps, and Google Photos. While Samsung has tried to build its own ecosystem with services like Samsung Pay, Bixby, and its own App Store, they've struggled to gain traction. Most users simply default to the superior Google services that are already built into the phone. This means Samsung is essentially building a beautiful house on land that it doesn't own. This reliance on third-party software creates a less cohesive user experience. For example, on a Samsung phone, you might have two app stores, Google Play and Galaxy Store, two voice assistants, Google Assistant and Bixby, and two payment systems, Google Pay and Samsung Pay. This duplication is confusing for users and adds unnecessary bloat to the software. Apple's singular vision means there's one way to do things, and it's usually polished and well integrated. Samsung's approach feels more like a collection of parts from different suppliers which, while functional, lacks the same level of polish and synergy. This difference in ecosystem strength became more and more important as smartphones became central to our digital lives. For many users, especially in the premium market, the phone is no longer just a device, it's a gateway to a whole world of interconnected services and products. Apple's ability to control both the hardware and the software allowed them to build a much more compelling and sticky ecosystem. Samsung, despite making excellent hardware, could never fully replicate this because they were always dependent on Google and other partners for the software experience. This fundamental disadvantage has made it incredibly difficult for them to lure high-end users away from Apple's clutches. For the first decade of the smartphone era, the market was all about explosive growth. Millions of people were buying their very first smartphone every year, and the upgrade cycles were fast. People would happily buy a new phone every 1 or 2 years to get the latest features. But by the late 2010s, that growth began to slow down dramatically. The market became saturated. Pretty much everyone in developed countries who wanted a smartphone already had one. The low-hanging fruit was gone, and the next billion users were in markets with much lower purchasing power. This slowdown meant that the main driver of sales shifted from first-time buyers to upgraders. And here's the problem: smartphones got too good. The improvements from one year to the next became more incremental. A phone from 2 or 3 years ago was still perfectly capable of running all the latest apps, taking great photos, and having all-day battery life. This meant people started holding onto their phones for longer. The 2-year upgrade cycle stretched to 3, 4, or even 5 years. Why spend $1,000 on a new flagship when your current phone still works just fine? At the same time, another significant trend emerged: the rise of the used and refurbished phone market. As new phones became more expensive, topping the $1,000 mark, many consumers started looking for better value in the second-hand market. A 2-year-old flagship iPhone or Galaxy, sold as a certified refurbished device, offered 90% of the performance of a new one for a fraction of the cost. This market grew rapidly, pulling away potential customers who might have otherwise bought a new mid-range device from Samsung. It created a new layer of competition that wasn't there before. These shifting dynamics hit Samsung particularly hard. As the global market leader in terms of volume, any slowdown in overall sales was going to affect them more than anyone. Their business model was built on selling a massive number of new devices every quarter. When people started holding onto their phones longer and buying used models instead, it directly impacted Samsung's bottom line. The entire landscape of the industry was changing, the gold rush was over, and now it was a much tougher, slower-paced game of retaining customers and fighting for a smaller pool of upgraders in a world that was no longer hungry for new phones. All of these factors, the rise of Chinese competitors, a confusing product lineup, a weaker ecosystem, and a slowing global market, have culminated in Samsung's current predicament. They are caught in a classic squeeze play. At the high end of the market, they are still struggling to truly beat Apple. While Samsung's flagship phones are technological marvels, with incredible screens and versatile cameras, Apple has the trump card of its powerful ecosystem and brand loyalty. For wealthy consumers who want a simple, seamless, and premium experience, the iPhone remains the default choice. Samsung is fighting for the premium Android user, but that's a smaller slice of the pie. Meanwhile, at the low end and mid-range, Samsung is getting crushed by the Chinese brands. Companies like Xiaomi, Realme, and Oppo are offering phones with incredibly competitive features, high refresh rate screens, fast-charging, capable cameras, at prices that Samsung struggles to match. These brands are lean, aggressive, and have captured the hearts and minds of budget-conscious consumers in key growth markets. Samsung's attempt to compete with its A-series and M-series has been a mixed bag. They've had some success, but they've lost the dominant position they once held. They are no longer the undisputed king of the affordable smartphone. This squeeze from both above and below has led to an erosion of their market leadership. In 2023, for the first time in over a decade, Apple surpassed Samsung to become the top smartphone shipper globally for the full year. While Samsung might retake the lead in certain quarters depending on launch cycles, the long-term trend is clear. Their comfortable reign is over. They are no longer the default choice at any single price point. If you want the best premium phone, you'll likely consider an iPhone. If you want the best value, you'll likely look at a Chinese brand. Samsung is stuck in the unenviable position of being the in-between choice. Ultimately, Samsung's core challenge is a crisis of identity. Are they a premium brand meant to compete with Apple, or are they a volume player meant to dominate the mainstream market? For years, they managed to be both. But the market has evolved, and competitors have sharpened their focus. Trying to be everything to everyone is no longer a winning strategy. To lead again, Samsung needs to find a clear, compelling answer to a simple question. Why should someone buy a Samsung phone in 2025? Without a strong answer, they risk being permanently squeezed out by rivals who know exactly who they are and who they're building for.